Okay, well, we're going to be staying on this topic. Let's bring in Brad Rowswell, Victorian Liberal State MP, for more. Brad, great to see you.
Likewise, Holly, thank you.
Brad, just continuing on this story. Now, devastating, these kinds of stats. I mean, simply heartbreaking, to say the least. If we are looking at COVID stats and figures and basing our current health approach and policy off of those kind of figures, why are mental health stats and figures being overlooked?
Well, Holly, it's a very good question, and it's a question that should rightly be answered by the Premier in Victoria, Daniel Andrews, by the Chief Health Officer in Victoria. I mean, the Premier, for a number of weeks now, for at least on 2 occasions, has promised that the Chief Psychological Officer in Victoria will be made available to media, so media can ask these sort of questions, so the public can have some certainty and some clarity, some openness about the shadow pandemic that has hit our communities, that has hit in a particular way, in a particularly devastating way, our young people. And he said that will happen, and it hasn't happened. And it's just not good enough. It's not 340 young people who have ended up in hospital or presented at emergency departments with mental health concerns. Holly, it's 342. And every single one of those young people, every single week that presents, has a story behind them. A story of tragedy, a story of hopelessness. And it's one thing to say that it's everyone's responsibility, but the community during this pandemic for the last 18 months or more have put their trust in political leaders to guide us through that, to guide us through this pandemic. And on this front, they have absolutely failed us. Every one of those 342 young people who are presenting at a hospital in Victoria is a tragedy. Any one person that presents at hospital this week in those circumstances is a tragedy, Holly, and we must be doing more. Now, we've got to offer people hope. We've had this conversation. We've got to offer people hope. We've got to offer people optimism. We've got to offer people a plan, a pathway out, a roadmap out of our current circumstance. So I'm here not just to tell you that it's all glum and it's all doom and gloom. We've actually been proactive in offering what that pathway might look like. We think that, statewide lockdowns should be banned. And when we reach that 70 to 80% vaccination rate in our state and around our nation, there should be no more lockdowns. As simple as that. We think that the parks should reopen. We think schools should reopen. As close as we are to VCE exams in Victoria, we think schools should reopen and reopen now. We think that the curfew should be lifted. The curfew that has no scientific evidence behind it. It should be lifted, and it should be lifted now. We think that rapid testing should be deployed where it makes sense to do that. And we think that this wasteful government spending on Labor's big build program, which is really a disaster on many fronts, subjected to billions of dollars of cost overruns, all the advertising on that should be redirected to getting more jabs in arms. There is an alternative. There is a better way, because the system at the moment, the way that we're going at the moment, is not working. And the people who are falling victim to this, tragically, are young people.
I wanted to ask you, Brad, Victoria's Chief Health Officer Brett Sutton has said that they will announce thresholds for low case numbers, within the next day or so. What is this likely to look like?
Well, for some time now, Holly, I think that the numbers that we've been looking at are wrong. I think that, there's a lot of people on social media who get excited by what our daily case numbers are and are looking at that sole number as a indicator as to whether we will continue a lockdown or not. What we should be looking at are broader figures than just the daily case numbers. Yes, those mystery cases are absolutely important. But how many, Holly, how many of those people who have COVID, who are in hospital, who are in ICU, I might add, far less than those young people who are on a weekly basis being admitted to hospital, how many of those people have been vaccinated? How many of those people have had the opportunity to be vaccinated and have chosen not to be vaccinated? I think we need to, as we reach closer to a 70 to 80% vaccination rate, and as more vaccinations get in the arms of Victorians and Australians, we need to be looking at this through a different lens. And we can't just keep on looking at the daily case numbers as an indicator of whether we should be locked down or locked up. The effect of this is devastating, and not just on the lives of young people. Since June 2019 to June this year, Holly, there have been some 71,000 Victorian businesses that have closed. and in this current economic circumstance, this current financial circumstance, are likely never to reopen again. That's 71,000 small businesses with a story behind it, who would otherwise employ people, who would otherwise provide employment and therefore a wage for people to put food on their table, to pay their school fees, to pay their power bills. There's devastation right around us. We think there is a better way, and we're not just being oppositional in this conversation, Holly. We're being propositional as well. We're proposing a way out. We're doing that. We think the Premier should be doing exactly the same thing. We should think there should be more optimism in the Premier's message, in what he's saying to Victorians, to give people hope, to offer people a pathway out of the current circumstance, which is just simply terrible.
Brad, I wanted to ask you, you're not the only one voicing these concerns. We've spoken to a lot of people at Ticker, politicians, we've spoken to psychiatrists, we've spoken to psychologists, we've spoken to doctors. Everybody is saying the same thing, concerns that these numbers, we need to change the way that we report the numbers. So if so many experts in their field are raising these concerns to the Premier, why isn't he listening?
That's a really good question, Holly. That's a really good question. Whenever, and I've told you what the opposition's perspective on these matters are. I've said to you that, and to Ticker viewers right around the nation, that there is an alternative here in Victoria. We've proposed what the alternative is, and I've gone through those points as well. And whenever those points are proposed in a respectful and in a courteous way to the Premier, his response is simply to dismiss it. He comes back with an answer on Sunday saying that whatever the opposition proposes isn't relevant to the important work that he does. I mean, how arrogant. This week, once again, the Victorian Parliament was meant to meet. And because a mid-ranking bureaucrat has decided that Parliament cannot sit, Parliament is not sitting this week. The very foundational institution of our democracy is being undermined because a mid-level bureaucrat has determined so. Well, I don't want to turn up to Parliament, Holly, just because I need some lead in my boots or an ego trip to say, oh, I've been to Parliament and I've thumped the dispatch box and I feel good about myself. No, my role as an elected representative here in Victoria, just like the other 88 members of the lower house and the 40-odd members of Victoria's upper house, is to represent the views of their electors, of their residents, of the people who bring to them their cares and their concerns. And it's to highlight a lens of scrutiny on the government decision making. And for as long as we continue to propose things constructively, we're simply being stonewalled by a Premier who doesn't want to listen, who thinks he's doing the right thing, but we know he's not, because the numbers tell us he's not doing the right thing. It's not just about COVID numbers, it's about the shadow pandemic, it's about the people who are being affected by this in a way that perhaps hasn't been considered in government decision making and should be considered in government decision making. And we can't take much more of this, Holly. That's the view from the ground.
I think you're voicing the concerns of many, and everyone has said the same thing. We need some form of hope. Brad, thank you so much for your time. As always, we'll catch up with you next week.
Look forward to it, Holly. Please do take care.